I have only one thing to say. You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
The grocer's daughter led the Conservative Party to 3 election victories.
The real thing about Margaret Thatcher is that she didn't just lead our country, she saved our country.
Known as the Iron Lady, she was loved and hated in equal measure and remains a divisive figure to this day.
That emphasis on liberalisation of economies and free markets also meant that that emphasis was really put within the financial sector as well, and you could say that some of the build-up of financial excesses in the 2000s and the subsequent crash found their seeds in the 80s and 90s.
Years later, Thatcher was blamed for worsening the divide between rich and poor.
stones, bricks and any other handy missiles at police and colliery buildings, the police responded by sending in a snatch squad. The miners resisted and the police moved forward en masse in a manoeuvre well tried and tested. During the struggles which followed, one policeman was hit on the head by a stone as several pickets were hauled away, eventually into waiting police vans. The strikers, Scottish miners reinforced by men from northeast England and Yorkshire, withdrew, regrouped and countercharged. There followed some of the most violent clashes on the picket lines in Scotland for some weeks. One miner, injured in the melee, was taken away by ambulance. More of his colleagues were arrested. NUM officials on the main gate said they cautioned against stone throwing without success, and the police say they warned the pickets before taking action. About 15 men defied the unions and carried out maintenance at Bilston Glen during the holiday period which has just finished. Another 15 reported for work this morning, and so in total there are no more men working now than before the holidays.
I'm glad that you are comfortable here. I know how much we owe to you for your help during the Falklands campaign. The information you gave us, communication, and also the reference you gave to any of our forces were able to get a shipwreck.
All levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That is the Liberal policy. Yes, it came out, he didn't intend it to, but he did.
hardly a surprise that Baroness Thatcher was careless over soup being poured over Lord Howe when she was apparently perfectly prepared to send him out to the wicket with a broken bat. Mr. Speaker, when I made my maiden speech, all in this chamber, a little over 2 decades ago, Margaret Thatcher had been elevated to the other place. But Thatcherism was still wreaking, as it had wreaked for the previous decade, the most heinous social, economic and spiritual damage upon this country, upon my constituency and my constituents. Our local hospitals were running on empty. Patients were staying on trolleys in corridors. I tremble to think what the death rate for pensioners would have been this winter if that version of Thatcherism had been fully up and running this year. Our schools, parents, teachers, governors, even pupils seem to spend an inordinate amount of time fundraising in order to be able to provide basic materials such as paper and pencils. The plaster on our classroom walls were kept in place by pupils' artwork and miles of sellotape. Our school libraries were dominated by empty shelves, very few books, and those books that were there, again, were being held together by ubiquitous sellotape and offcuts from teachers' wallpaper used to bind those volumes so that they could at least hang together. But by far the most dramatic and heinous demonstration of Thatcherism was certainly not only in London, but across the whole country in metropolitan areas, where every single shop doorway, every single night became the bedroom, the living room, the bathroom for the homeless. They grew in their thousands, and many of those homeless people had been thrown out onto the streets from the closure of the long-term mental hospitals. We were told it was going to be called care in the community. What in effect it was no care at all in the community. I was interested to hear about Baroness Thatcher's willingness to invite those who had nowhere to go for Christmas. It's a pity she didn't start building more and more social houses after she entered into the right to buy. So perhaps there would have been fewer homeless people than there were. As a friend of mine said, during her era, London became a city Hogarth would have recognised, and indeed he would. But the basis to Thatcherism, and this is where I come to the spiritual part of what I regard as the desperately wrong track that Thatcherism took this country into, is that we were told that everything I had been taught to regard as a vice, and I still regard them as vices, under Thatcherism was in fact a virtue. Greed, selfishness, no care for the weaker, sharp elbows, sharp knees, they were the way forward. We heard much over and will continue to hear over the next week of the barriers that were broken down by Thatcherism, the establishment that was destroyed.
Can't take it.
What we actually saw, the word that has been circling around with stars around it, is that she created an aspirational society. It aspired for things. As indeed one of the former prime ministers, who himself had been elevated to the House of Lords, spoke about selling off the family silver, and people knowing under those years the price of everything and the value of nothing. What concerns me is that I am beginning to see possibly the re-emergence of that total traducing of what I regard as being the basis spiritual nature of this country, where we do care about society, where we do believe in communities, where we do not leave people to walk by on the other side. That isn't happening now. And if we go back to the heyday of that era, I think we will see replicated yet again the extraordinary human damage that we as a nation have suffered from, the talent that has been totally wasted because of the inability to genuinely see the individual value of every single human being. My honourable friend from Hackney referred to the fact that although she had differed with Lady Thatcher in her policies, she felt duty-bound to come to pay tribute to the first woman Prime Minister this country had produced. I am a generation who was raised by women. The men had all gone to war to defend our freedoms. They didn't just run a government, they ran a country. And the women that I knew who raised me and millions of people like me, who ran our factories and our businesses, put out the fires when the bombs dropped, they would not have recognized their definition of womanliness as being incorporated an iconic model of Margaret Thatcher, to pay tribute to the first Prime Minister deputed by female gender. Okay, but a woman not on my terms.
Just yesterday, former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher passed away. For those of you who are avid corporate media watchers, your impression of her legacy might look something like this.
I think she's probably the greatest Prime Minister of Britain since Churchill. Regardless of the ideological things we can always fight about.
You never had to wonder where Margaret Thatcher stood on the issues. I will not change just to court popularity. She was known to be uncompromising, especially when it came to her principles of economic and individual freedom.
She was called the Iron Lady, unbending and driven, respected and feared. Whether it was ideology or economics, trade unions or terrorists, it was agree with Maggie or get out of the way.
Right, the uncompromising Iron Lady, the woman who saved Britain. Look, it's no surprise that the media is exploiting public emotions over her death and turning her into some sort of heroic demagogue, which is perhaps the most dangerous part, the idea that after her death, criticizing her leadership and the role she played in global politics is taboo. Allowing this one-sided narrative to cement her legacy means ignoring the ugly side of history. For example, don't expect a cry from the people in Argentina for the former British PM, who led the Malvinas War in 1982 and was responsible for sinking one of their Navy ships, which killed 32 sailors on board. Claudia Remisara of the Hispanic New York blog iterates that, quote, to some Argentinians, Thatcher is like Hitler is to Britain in the 1940s, a big monster. You won't find any sympathy for her at popular level. Look, these may seem like harsh words, but they're merely a reflection of the continued public sentiment. But perhaps she was never more on the wrong side of history than when it came to apartheid in South Africa. Despite campaigns for the release of Nelson Mandela from prison and a call for the isolation from the South African government, Thatcher remained comfortable with the idea of apartheid, once referring to Mandela and the African National Congress as a, quote, typical terrorist organization. But her divisive politics weren't limited to what was happening across the pond. This holds especially true in Northern Ireland, where the 11 years of Thatcherism is still widely regarded as the worst period of the conflict. Her policy of militarization and censorship created deep sectarian division and threw basic human rights to the wayside. In Britain, Thatcher presided with a style of tyrannical austerity and strict devotion to privatization, taking on unions in a divide and conquer strategy, and referring to dissenters from the labor movement as an enemy from within. Needless to say, Margaret Thatcher was a tyrant, an autocratic demagogue who cared more about corporate control and profit than she did about human rights. But the coverage of her death serves as a reminder of the intent of the corporate media to ignore the ugly side of history and instead revere establishment figures almost as deities, influential and infallible. To not discuss the dark side of this reality out of respect for her recent passing is not only irresponsible, it's a propaganda technique that whitewashes history. History we will never learn from if we allow it to be twisted.
I'm so glad to hear that Margaret's got dementia. It's a kind of thing a just God would have sent her. As she dribbles to her death, shit and piss all down her dress. Let us hope that she's enjoying this adventure. People seem to think that Dennis must have liked her, but I think that he lost interest once he biked her. He just sat drinking G&T while she buggered up the country. It's no wonder that the miners want to strike her. I'll be glad to clean her grave up with a mop, just as long as there's a dance floor on the top. People say she was a hero, but we know she's just a zero. And it looks as though she's heading for the chop. Lord Reardon's match.
This was the biggest mass picket in South Yorkshire since the strike began. There were at least 6,000 miners, perhaps many more, and they stretched back as far as the eye could see. Facing them were 700 policemen in full riot gear, with another 500 waiting close by. There was an atmosphere of real tension, with neither side knowing what the other would do next. The pickets tore the bricks from a wall and hurled them at the police, and merely jeered when told to stop doing so.
Now stop throwing missiles!
The pickets were in angry mood, furious that 6 NUM members had gone back to work yesterday. This morning that number had increased to 7, and once they were safely inside, the police advanced, clambering over the debris of bricks and trees torn down by the pickets. They advanced in stages, and the pickets retreated, and a potentially dangerous confrontation had been avoided. As the pickets began to disperse, the police slowly pulled back. One officer was taken to hospital after being hit on the shoulder by this brick. But what disturbed the police most was the collection of marbles that had been fired at them by catapult.